The quiet of the Karoo is something most people never experience. No traffic, no city lights, just vast, open darkness, and the kind of silence that makes you feel completely alone. But on one particular night in March 2012, that silence was shattered by something that would divide an entire nation and leave questions that still don't have clean answers. Today we are talking about the Griekwastad farm murders, one of the most disturbing and controversial criminal cases in South African history. And I want to warn you before we go any further, this story involves the deaths of 3 people, including a mother and a child. It is heavy, it is complicated, and depending on what you believe, it is either a story about a terrible monster or a story about a system that failed someone who desperately needed help. Let's go back to March 2012. The town of Griekwastad sits in the northern Cape province of South Africa. It is remote, it is dry, it is the kind of place where everybody knows their neighbors and strangers get noticed. The Steenkamp family lived on a farm outside this small town. On the night of March 7th, Dion Steenkamp, his wife Christelle, and their daughter Marthella were shot and killed on the property. There was a single survivor, their teenage son, Hardis, who was 15 years old at the time. Now, here is where this story takes its first sharp turn. Hardis initially told police that armed intruders had attacked the family. He described being tied up, hearing gunshots, managing to free himself and escape to a neighboring farm to get help. On the surface, this sounded like another devastating farm attack. South Africa has a deeply painful history with rural violence, and farm murders carry enormous political weight in that country. Initial reports treated this as exactly that kind of tragedy. But investigators quickly started finding things that did not fit. The physical evidence at the scene was inconsistent with the story Hardis had told. The way the bodies were positioned, the trajectories of the bullets, the absence of evidence pointing to multiple intruders, all of it started pointing investigators in a very different direction. And then there was Hardis himself. His demeanor during questioning reportedly struck investigators as unusual. The details of his account changed. Things that should have matched did not match. Within days, the investigation had shifted dramatically. Hardis Steenkamp, 15 years old, was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. The deaths of his own father, mother, and little sister. South Africa stopped and stared. How does a 15-year-old kill his entire family? Why? What could possibly lead to something like this? And the question that haunted so many people, was he even capable of receiving a fair trial and appropriate justice given his age? Now let me be clear here. Hardis was tried as a juvenile, which under South African law meant the proceedings were handled differently than an adult trial. He was eventually convicted in 2013 on all 3 counts of murder. The court found that the evidence against him was overwhelming. The forensic evidence, the inconsistencies in his statements, witness testimony, all of it built a case that the judge found convincing beyond reasonable doubt. But the conviction did not silence the controversy. Not even close. Here is something that gets discussed a lot when people dig into this case. The question of motive. Prosecutors argued that financial pressure on the farm and a difficult family situation contributed to what happened. There were suggestions of significant conflict within the household. Reports emerged describing a home environment that was strained in ways that outsiders had not seen. Without excusing anything, the picture that emerged was of a teenager under enormous psychological pressure in an isolated environment with almost no access to support systems. And this is where the emotional weight of this case really hits you. Because you have 3 innocent people who lost their lives, a father, a mother, a young girl who had her entire life ahead of her. Their deaths were real, and their suffering was real, and nothing changes that. And at the same time, you have a 15-year-old boy, a child under South African law, who was clearly in a state of profound crisis that nobody around him had recognized or addressed in time. 2 tragedies layered on top of each other. The sentencing created its own wave of controversy. Because Hardis was a minor at the time of the crime, the sentence handed down was shaped by that fact. He was sent to a youth correctional facility. Many people, particularly those close to the victims, felt this was insufficient. Others argued that the juvenile justice system exists precisely for situations like this, where the perpetrator is a child and where the goal of the system should include rehabilitation alongside accountability. There is a conversation in criminology that this case forces into the open. When a minor commits an act of extreme violence, what is the right response from society? Pure punishment? Rehabilitation? Some combination? And how do we weigh justice for victims against the developmental reality that young brains, young people in crisis, are fundamentally different from adults making calculated decisions? I am not here to give you a clean answer on that. Nobody has one. What I do want to talk about is the aftermath, because this case did not end with a conviction and a sentence. It echoed. In the years following the trial, the case continued to be discussed, debated, and in some corners re-examined. Some people never accepted the conviction, convinced that the original story of an outside attack was true and that the investigation had gone wrong. Others accepted the verdict but wrestled with the haunting question of what warning signs had been missed. In South African media, Griekwastad became a kind of shorthand. It came up whenever farm violence was discussed. It came up whenever the juvenile justice system was debated. It became one of those cases that accumulates meaning far beyond its original facts. And there is one more layer here that I think deserves attention. The isolation factor. The Karoo is not just geographically remote. For the families who live out there, the isolation can be psychological too. Mental health resources in rural South Africa are scarce. For a teenager struggling with whatever was happening in that household, the options for reaching out, for getting help, for having someone intervene were essentially non-existent. This does not explain what happened, but it might help us understand how something like this becomes possible when every safeguard fails. I think about the neighbors who noticed nothing, the teachers who saw nothing, the community that through no particular fault of its own simply did not have the infrastructure to catch a family in freefall before it was too late. What really happened that night? The court gave an answer. The forensic evidence pointed one way. The judge reviewed everything and reached a verdict. And yet the human question, the one about how a family gets to that point, about what a 15-year-old carries inside him that leads to an act like this, that question does not have a court verdict. It sits there, unresolved, the way the worst tragedies always do. 3 people died on a farm in the Karoo in March of 2012. A family was destroyed in a single night. And whatever you believe about guilt, about justice, about what should have been done differently, those deaths are the unmovable center of this story. Real people, real loss. If this case does anything useful, maybe it asks us to look harder at the families living in isolation, at the teenagers carrying weights they were never supposed to carry alone, at the systems that should catch people before everything falls apart. Because the scariest part of the Griekwastad story is not the violence. The scariest part is how invisible all of it was, right up until the moment it was not. If you found this video meaningful, please subscribe and leave a comment below, telling me what you think South Africa, and honestly any society, should do differently when it comes to mental health support in isolated rural communities. I will be reading everything you share.